outside the Royal Courts of Justice with activist and campaigner George Turner, who's just arrived to deliver his appeal papers to the Royal Courts of Justice, the High Court, the highest court in the land, Privy Council technically, but the highest court that matters. And George has got all these very vitally important court documents that are going to try and stop the redevelopment of the Shell building lashed to his bike.
Yeah, so basically I'm here today to file the papers to start my appeal against the decision that I had against me in January of the High Court case. So originally I took a case to the High Court to try and to stop Shell redeveloping the Shell Centre and building lots and lots of luxury flats that we don't care for or need for massive amounts of profit and gaming the system so they don't need to deliver any of the social benefit. And I thought that that actually was not good enough. That's not the way that a planning process should work, because the whole point of the planning process is there to deliver the social benefits that the people need. Because at the end of the day, these buildings are going to be there for hundreds of years. They don't want to be determined by short-term market fads which last a couple of years. They need to be built to last. That's why we have a planning system. Yeah, so last year I brought a High Court challenge to the decision of Secretary of State Eric Pickles to grant planning permission for the partial demolition and redevelopment of the Shell Centre into 870 odd new flats. 90% will be luxury housing going into the kind of foreign investment market, with 10% being housing for old people stuck at the bottom in the dark with no natural daylight. And basically I was really upset with the way that the planning process had worked out, because as with so many cases throughout the country, the planners at all stages, from the Mayor to Lambeth Council to the Secretary of State to the Inspector, just gave the impression that they could not care less about the views of the public. Now, the point about a planning system is that it's meant to be a public system, and it's meant to capture the views of the public so that we can all have a city that we can be proud of and take part in the growth of that city. And so there's some certain legal provisions they have to do in order to take views of the public and to make sure those views are taken into account. I believe that they weren't, so I brought a High Court challenge here. And of course the Shell building, the Shell Centre redevelopment, is just one part of a massive redevelopment that is happening on the south bank of the River Thames, which is going to fundamentally change our city forever. So you've got Elizabeth House, which is just next to the Shell Centre. That's going to pop up again behind the Festival Hall, and UNESCO have said that how the government treats Elizabeth House as a planning application is the litmus test to see whether we want to keep our World Heritage status of Westminster, and the government have done naff all about it. Mr. Justice Collins gave his judgment in February, and he substantially agreed with me on a lot of the stuff that we were saying. He said that the behaviour of the inspector was completely inappropriate, that he had misconducted his conduct at the inquiry, and he had no doubt that I reasonably felt that he was treating our side and the other objectors unfairly, but that he didn't quash the decision because he didn't find it was kind of substantial prejudice, which is the legal term. Now, today I'm going to file papers at the Court of Appeal to challenge the decision of Collins, because I think it's unacceptable that you have a process where a public official behaves in such a way, and that process is allowed to come to a decision which will lead to a £1.6 billion decision which will affect over 100 million people, right? 100 million people walk through Waterloo every year, commute into Waterloo. Another 18 million people visit the South Bank, tourists. It's in the heart of London, it's in the background to the World Heritage Site. This decision will affect hundreds of millions of people, and it's taken by a decision, or it's done on the basis of recommendation made by a public official, which most people agree is incompetent. And I think if you read the judgment, you're left in little doubt as to the thoughts of the judge as to the competence of the planning inspector. And it's my view that we can't take decisions in that way, so I have to go to court to stop them.
We're stood here in front of the Shell building. This is the epicentre of the development. What's going to happen here? What's going to be built here?
So the plans are to keep this massive tower that they've got behind me. That's still going to remain. But they've got these things called the wing buildings, which kind of jut out from the tower and wrap around. And that used to be loads of office space for the workers at Shell. It's been mothballed for several years. There's no one in there, and the office workers are in Canary Wharf. So they want to demolish those wing buildings, and they also want to demolish the open spaces that are on the Shell Centre site. What they're going to replace it with is 8 towers. 2 of them, I think, are going to be taller than the current Shell building, and they're going to be kind of slightly behind the Shell building, and then they're going to kind of cascade downwards. There's going to be a tiny public square in the middle of the building, again surrounded by tall buildings. And if you look at the daylight calculations for that square, you'll see that 99.3% of the square will be in near permanent shadow.
Who are the developers of the site? Yeah,
so the case is George Turner versus the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, Braeburn Estates, which is a joint venture between the Canary Wharf Group and the Qatari royal family, the Shell International Petroleum Company, the Mayor of London and Lambeth Council. So pretty much everyone in the world is lined up to support this development, but they all have an interest in it, and it's really, important that the public's voice is heard, and despite all these private interests, that the will of the public is the one which is determinative at the end of the day. Because at the end of the day, Canary Wharf Group are going to develop this, go away and just sit off the profits, but actually we are going to have to live with this thing. So our voice as the public should be the most important in this process, and it wasn't, and that's why I've come to change these things.
George, can you tell me about the financing of this development, and also if there's any kind of affordable or social housing as part of it?
So that's the real issue here, is that we're losing a lot, right? We're losing public open spaces, we're losing the openness of this part of the South Bank by having this massive, oppressive cluster of buildings here. We're possibly losing and damaging really important views and cultural monuments. And what are we getting from it? And Lambeth Council will tell you that this is, much needed housing, and that there's a housing crisis, and therefore we need to build more housing. And there's going to be around 870 odd flats built on this site, but almost exclusively they're being built for the very rich, right? They're going to be the type of housing that is sold off-plan to investors with money often of questionable origin, and we know that many of these flats will be unoccupied. Only 10% of the flats will be classed as affordable, and they'll be in the very worst parts of the building, around the ground floors, first to third floors, where there'll be no natural daylight. And quite shockingly, actually, they're being reserved for older people, which is, I think, a particularly evil thing to do, because old people don't go out much during the day. They could be disabled. They spend a lot of time at home. So putting them in flats where there's practically no natural daylight is cruel and inhuman. As with all of these massive developments across London, the council and everyone would have liked more affordable housing, perhaps in nicer parts of the building, which aren't being constantly overshadowed and dreary and drab. But the developer said that the financial viability of the scheme didn't allow it. So if they built more affordable housing, there wouldn't be enough profits in the scheme to allow them to build the scheme. So there was no point doing it, and it had to be what it is. It is what it is. With all these things, that whole viability study was secret. No one could have access to it. So there was no way of real challenging these assertions made by the developers. But when it went to a public inquiry, we campaigned really hard to try and get some of this out into the open, because in a public inquiry, everything should be in the public. The clue is in the name, a public inquiry. But what we found during the Shell Centre inquiry is that they were seeking a 20% annual profit, and if they didn't get 20% a year, they would refuse to build the thing. So they're saying, if we don't get the 20%, we're not going to do it. So you better allow us to have 20%, otherwise you're not going to get your building. And the council and Boris and Secretary of State all caved to that. And actually, it's just not an acceptable position to say I'm somebody who's really rich and I want more money, and therefore you've got to give it to me. The public process is there to prevent these kinds of things happening. It's there to act in the public interest. And the public interest is that we have good quality housing, which is affordable to people living in London, which is built at not an excessive profit, by people who actually want to build good, decent housing, and none of that was happening here. The council looked at their economic study, and they did their own report, which criticised it, went through it, said, we accept this, we don't accept that, and that had some of the data in it, and it was very revealing, because what it showed was that when they were telling the council, the developers, which were Canary Wharf Group and Qatari DR and Shell, they presented a valuation to the council and said, we think we're going to be able to make, the figure was £1,275 a square foot on average for the flats we're selling. So the flats they'll sell, the average pounds per square foot will be 1,275. And Lambeth didn't agree with that. They thought it was a bit low, so they pushed it up a bit to 1,330. We then found out through a confidential document that was leaked to our campaign that at the same time, the very same people that Shell and Canary Wharf Group and Qatari DR had commissioned to give these valuations to the council were also in the city telling investors that they were expecting much higher values. And the difference, if you looked across the whole scheme, was around £300 million. So it appeared at least that they had deliberately undervalued the scheme by about £300 million, which is not a small chunk of change, in order to get out of building more affordable housing. Now, that to me is completely shocking. Well, you see, the studies that have been done show that a lot of these buildings, particularly this high-value property in central London, is built and is bought off-plan by foreign investors, and we actually don't know often who's behind that money. It's money of questionable origin. It's anonymous. It's been coming through offshore secrecy jurisdictions and tax havens, managed by anonymous companies, behind them sometimes sitting trusts who we don't know the benefits of those trusts. It may be that it's a corrupt official in Africa who's been paid a bribe, and he puts that money in an offshore company, and that offshore company buys a home so that they have something of value to kind of retire on when they leave their civil service job in wherever they work. Transparency International recently did a big study of London property and how much is owned by anonymous companies, offshore companies. There's been other studies done over the last few years, and I think it's really an unacceptable position where we're selling the soul of our city for vast amounts of cash, of which we know very little, and we, I think, as a society can do better than that.